Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm Finlo Costain, Chief Editor of 8.9.com. This is the third episode in our new series, Farmgate Leaders, in which I have a conversation with someone who's playing a defining role in changing our food and farming system. So today, I'm joined by the filmmaker and self-described wrangler of scientists, Peter Byck, who's also a professor of practice at Arizona State University. Peter's directed shows for MTV, starring Nicolas Cage and Drew Barrymore, edited documentaries for Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, and made docs and promotional shorts for The West Wing. But Peter is also the director and producer of Carbon Cowboys and Roots So Deep, and before that, Carbon Nation. He has a gift for storytelling, for breaking down complex science and giving it a human face. His big passion is adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and his films are hugely influential. Peter, great to see you.
Oh, that was a great intro, man. I'm going to make sure my mom sees this show. It's great to see you, Phil.
Well, we're going to talk about your mom later, so maybe
Sweet.
you wait on that. Carbon Nation, your great big climate change movie produced back in 2010, focused primarily on technology to replace fossil fuels. There were farmers in it, but it wasn't kind of the big thing. But in Roots So Deep, there are farmers everywhere, and frankly, the most advanced technology is an electric fence. So what is it that connects those two projects?
Well, Carbon Nation was our hunt for solutions to climate change. In that hunt, we found energy efficiency was a huge one. We found clean energy was a huge one. We found that leadership was a huge one. And then we found that land use was a huge one. How we treated our farmland, how we treated pastures, how we treated forests, massive contributors of climate change, greenhouse gases, and massive opportunities to be drawing down those greenhouse gases and making them useful in those systems. So Rattan Lal was my sort of lead guy in Carbon Nation on the data. And he was basically saying if we really did well with forests, stop burning them, we really did well with farming, and we really did well with pasture land, we could draw down a third of human emissions of the greenhouse gases and get a leg up. Then I go to the Rodale Institute, which we also filmed in Carbon Nation, and they're saying with compost, no-till, cover crops, you could draw down all of human emissions. You could counterbalance all the human emissions of CO2 through farming. And so I went with the conservative number just because that's what we wanted to do with Carbon Nation, to make sure that people didn't assail us for being too Pollyanna. But because of that film, I learned about soils. And because of that, I focused on soils as a solution idea. And then when I met Alan Williams, who was focused on regenerative grazing, I realized that that was the thing I wanted to focus on. And so we made a short film in 2013, right when it was while I was transitioning out to Arizona State University from a freelance life. In that short film, Soil Carbon Cowboys had Alan Williams, Gabe Brown, and Neil Dennis. And that short 12-minute movie, which was really, really hard to make, doesn't look like it. I guess that's good, but it was. All of Roots So Deep bloomed out of that, all of it. And so that little short film created all this science, all this work.
Now, both with Carbon Nation and also Roots So Deep and everything in between, it seems that you are they're presenting climate solutions. And indeed, it's even there in the subtitle, I think, with Carbon Nation. You don't have to believe in climate change to want to be part of this, because
Yeah.
it's about more than simply solving an environmental problem. How important is that to be able to sort of straddle both sides of that fence in order to deliver the solutions?
I mean, for me, it's huge. When we were making Carbon Nation, we realized if we just stayed an inch above the debate, we could talk to a lot more people and get a lot more people to listen. So I joke about it, but it was true. My uncle Phil and his college roommate, they were Harvard class of 54, would send me all these climate denier articles, knowing I was making a film about climate change solutions. And at first, it really pissed me off. And then I realized it was a big gift because they were making me think about them. So then I had to think, okay, well, where is this solution that I like for climate change going to benefit them? Energy efficiency. I mean, do you want to give a kid asthma and have that cold beer, or not give a kid asthma and still have that cold beer? Energy efficiency can get you there. Clean energy can get you there. So it was those sorts of things. And then when we were making Carbon Nation, I met this guy in Alaska, Bernie Carl, who was a master recycler. He built an entire greenhouse in Alaska that made lettuce all year long, and every piece of it was recycled material from the landfill, every single piece. He reinvented a Carrier air conditioning unit, reverse engineered it so that he could use the cold water from the stream and the steam from geothermal, that differential to create the power for his entire resort, Chena Hot Springs. And he didn't think humans were causing climate change. Yet he was doing all that cool stuff. And he taught me to just ask the simple question, do you like clean air? Do you like clean water? That's the common ground. And so that was really helpful for me. So when we were making Carbonation, we could speak to the skeptic, speak to the folks who thought climate change was a hoax and Al Gore was a fraud. I heard that so much when I was on tour, but just show them that there was really beneficial things. The Department of Defense was doing all sorts of work on clean energy and energy efficiency because it was a national security issue. Okay, so national security is a reason to look at, you know, clean energy. No one was talking about that.
And I think that's a really important point. Nobody was talking about it. And I can remember back in 2013, 2014, I was beginning to have conversations with the British Conservative Party
Mhm.
about, because at the time, there were no more than a handful of conservative politicians that were prepared to stand up in public and say that they believed that climate change was a clear and present danger. And so it was all about, well, how do we frame these conversations about climate change in ways that will attract people, whether it's health and nutrition, whether it's about flooding in their constituency, whether it's about agriculture and the impacts and resilience on the land. But those conversations, again, here, they were really new. There were very few of us actually doing it and having those conversations. So you must have been at the vanguard in the US having those conversations. Finally, it feels like environmental organizations have started to catch up and they're trying to win people to the cause, rather than just kind of banging them over the head with the problems. They're talking about the opportunities. Do you feel like the conversation has moved on in the course of the last 15 years?
In a way, yes. In a way, no. Um, you know, there's a lot of politically conservative states in the United States that are leading in wind, Iowa, Texas, right? So there's a lot of really good clean energy going on because it's good business. And so that's a true conservative, when you think of the definition of the word, way to be. And so that's good news. And that's what we said all along. This is just going to save you money. It's good business. So don't worry about climate change. One of our guys in Carbonation, he's now a US congressman. Um, he talks about even if you're a greedy bastard, this is something you would want to do, right? With clean energy stuff, because it just saves money. He had a company that captured the heat coming out of a steel factory or an aluminum factory, use that heat, spin a turbine, create electricity to then power that plant, right? Um, and that's when I learned how complicated this stuff is. We don't have national policy in the United States when it comes to energy. So he had a plant on one side of State Road 23 in West Virginia, and he had an office on the other side of State Road 23 in West Virginia. He would capture the heat coming out of the plant and want to use electricity in the office, but he couldn't string a line across the state road because that was a monopoly, and the utility in that county had the monopoly. And that's what the United States is, just patchwork. It's like a crazy quilt, right? That's a phrase that our editor Ben Daughtry came up with thinking about how he was going to edit Roots So Deep, but it's the energy craziness in this country. Um, so when you talk about climate change, there's still a real debate with some folks, but I don't care because all the things that will solve it, in my opinion, are still beneficial to all those people still choosing not to believe that climate change is real. So again, I don't try to change someone's mind. I just work on finding where we agree. And that just takes listening. And that's the magic. That's the magic. And so it translates ffinlo right to soil health. And so what we were kind of saying about climate change and all the solutions from carbonation, what we're saying in Roots So Deep is soil health itself is the big tent. And so you have all sorts of entrances to this tent. And there's no bouncers from nightclubs in LA keeping you out. Um, and so I came in it through the climate change entrance. I know people who are religious and they come to it through their stewardship, through their own faith. I know people who come into that soil health big tent through water security, food security, human health, food nutrient density, wildlife protection. And so that's really the game right now. It's this soil health works for everyone. And you just have to listen to see, are you into birds? Are you into grassland birds? Well, guess what? You're not going to have them if you don't have healthy grasslands. And guess what? You're not going to have healthy grasslands without animal impact. And guess what? Animal impact, it's not just animals, it's the way you manage them. And if you use regenerative grazing principles like adaptive grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing, or whatever you want to call it, that's how you're going to get the healthiest grasslands. That's how you're going to get bird habitat back. And so it all comes from soil health. That's where I've landed.
Let's come back to where you've landed, but let's go back to the beginning before we do, Peter. And let's talk about baby Byck. Where did you grow up? What did your folks do? How did you get into this?
Yeah. Well, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky right now. This is where I was born and raised. This is our house that we bought in 2009 when our son was a baby. He's now 6'1" and he's upstairs getting ready to go to the gym with his cousin. And I was raised here. My mom, my dad loved nature. We would go on hikes in the weekend and just went to this place called Bernheim Forest, which Mr. Bernheim was a bourbon distiller who had a lot of money, and he put 10,000 acres aside and said, "I'm going to save this for the world." And I got married out there to my wife Krishna. We got married at Bernheim Forest. Um, I was taught not to litter. My mom used to stop on the side of country roads for us to pick up trash for real. Um, and she didn't give us the shiny jackets for safety. It was just you're out there. I don't even think she gave us a bag. I think we just had to pick up the trash. We didn't even have the stick with the little pokey thing on the end of it.
No, no, no,
And
no.
and so I've always loved nature. I used to cut school to go hang out in the woods. I would cut school and go
Were,
read my assignment out in the woods.
were you a bad kid if you were cutting school, or was it just that you were doing school in a different location?
I was the quiet bad kid, so no one knew I was a bad kid. I wasn't a bad kid, but I did things like cut school. That wasn't good. But I then did my homework when I cut school. So, right, there's my parents got divorced when I was 13, and so I didn't live with my dad anymore. So I would cut school to go have lunch with him, right? So I was usually doing something beneficial, but there were times where I was definitely not doing things beneficial when I was cutting school.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
and my
Tell
friends
me
Jeff Stewart could tell you that. Yeah, yeah,
Tell me about Kentucky, because I mean, the way that you're describing it makes it feel like a very rural sort of environment. And you and I are
yeah.
not dissimilar in age, and the things you're
Yep.
talking about are familiar. So when I was a kid, if I dropped even a tiny bit of silver paper that I couldn't find, from a sweet wrapper, then I'd find myself by picking up 10 other pieces of litter that I found.
Yeah.
And in those days, I used to wear a 6-inch blade sheath knife to school, which you couldn't even think about these days. You'd have a SWAT team around you. So it's a very different
Right.
sort of lifestyle. So what was it
What was the
like growing up?
yeah, well, I was just going to ask you real quick. What was the
Yeah.
purpose of your knife? Was it
Whittling and playing, you toss it in the school field and you play games where you sort of throw the knife and you'd stride a
yeah,
little bit further out to it and that sort of thing.
got it. I got you. So for me, I rode my bike a lot in the country. We lived out in the country for about 4 years. And my parents built a house out in this area called Prospect, Kentucky. We lived on Wolfpin Trace Road, which was off of Wolfpin Branch Road. And we had like 4 acres that went down into a creek. And when it flooded, it was amazing. And when that creek froze, it was just amazing. I loved nature. I spent as much time outside as I could. I actually would shoot baskets a lot, and we didn't have a net, and that ball would go down that hill. And to this day, I'm like, why didn't we just put a net there? But I spent a lot of time chasing, and I had a dog who we got when I was a year and a half old. He was a standard poodle, so they're hunters, and was able to be himself out there, and he would hunt. And his name was Yankee. And Yankee's favorite meal was a squirrel that was about 3 weeks old that he had buried. And then to make sure he ate it downwind from me while I was shooting baskets, so I got to really enjoy it with him. It was pretty robust.
Yeah, I
Um,
imagine. And you got wolves there in the names of those roads. Were you surrounded by wolves?
I never saw a wolf.
No.
Um, I certainly saw coyotes when I went out to California for film school. It was still Cal Arts was still in an area that wasn't built up, and I absolutely saw packs of coyotes out
Mm.
there. Um, the wildlife I saw was tame. It was tame. We need wolves in Kentucky. The deer population is well beyond healthy. It's dangerous and it's making the deer sick. They're overeating so much, and they need to be balanced. So
Mm.
we need wolves in Kentucky. Um, that's always a very controversial thing, but I guess we'll find out. Um, but
Are they
but
nearby? Do they have to be, would they have to be imported, or are they kind of just over the county boundary or something?
I don't know if there's wolves in the state of
Mm.
Kentucky. I don't know. I know there's some bears. I know some bears are coming back, so maybe there's some wolves. But like the wolves were introduced into Yellowstone, and
Mm.
having that keystone species just changes ecosystems, just as pulling out the keystone species changes ecosystems in a negative way. But I love nature, and I got into film school. I heard about film school, and I'm like, film school. It just like hit me. I was sitting under a tree when I was 16, and I called up Cal Arts because that was the catalog that I had seen. I said, "How do I get into the film school?" And the woman sort of paused for a second. She said, "Make a movie?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense." I was taking lots of still pictures. I loved music. I would hitchhike to movies, see them for 4 times. So I was sort of built for that idea. And I borrowed my buddy Bill Stark's Super 8 camera, and I made a movie. And the movie is basically my version, not knowing it, of Koyaanisqatsi. It's exactly that same sort of nature, 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 introducing humans. Humans really screw everything up. It's destructive, right? Like that was, and I put it to side 4 of Quadrophenia. Like once the singing stops into and through Love, Rain Over Me, and I got into film school. It was just a nature film, so
Just
it's always been there.
take me back a little bit. You said your parents got divorced, but what did they do, and who did you end up living with?
Yeah. So my parents got married like right out of college in 58. My dad had his first son in 1960, my brother Dan. And so my dad's dad died about a month, 2 months after my brother was born. And my dad's first Father's Day as a dad was his first Father's Day without his dad. And so my dad ran a family business. He was third generation. It was a clothing store, department store that focused on women and children. And it was called Byck's. And it started in Atlanta and then moved to Louisville in 1902. It was Byck Brothers shoe store. And then my grandfather took it over with my grandmother, and then my dad took it over. My mom, her dad was pissed that she got married. He wanted her to go to med school. So my grandfather was very forward thinking. My mom was the oldest, so he just treated her like his oldest. He didn't care male, female. He's like, "You're going to med school." She got married. She moved to Kentucky. She was an artist and she made things. She made like she would do these things out of paraffin wax, like human figures, and then do the lost wax thing where you make the plaster mold around it and you pour brass into it, and the paraffin goes away and you have a brass figure. And then she was an administrator at the Louisville School of Art. And so in the late 60s, I was born in 64. So when I was 4, 5, and 3, 4, and 5, I was hanging out with artists in the late 60s, right? So, I mean, we're talking mod, hippies, all that stuff. And I'm painting and loving it, just having a ball. And so that was part of me. And then my mom opened an art gallery with a friend of hers when I was 6. And so she had monthly shows or bi-monthly shows, and I would be there and I would help in any way I could. and my dad had the family store. And so I remember I was sort of brought up with business and art. And my dad also helped start a regional theater called Actors Theater of Louisville, which is a very well-known regional theater in the States. Some major plays that became major movies, like On Golden Pond, started at Actors Theater of Louisville. I think Equus did too, but I'm not
Mhm.
sure about that. And then they got divorced in 77, and my dad got remarried, and he married a playwright whose career was just starting off. Her name's Marcia Norman. She's very successful. Their marriage lasted 77 to 86. My mom got remarried around the same time, and she's still married to her second husband, who's a banker, financier guy. And so then my dad moved to New York when he got married to Marcia, and they produced a play together called Night Mother. He produced it, she wrote it, and it went to Broadway. Both actors got nominated for Tonys, and it won a Pulitzer Prize. And then they made it into a movie, and it was while they were making that movie that Marcia left my dad, and then my dad was like, "I'm moving to California." So I went to Cal Arts for film school. I graduated in 86. My dad moved out. And so from 86 to 98, we were just buds. He became my best friend. We would just, hey, you want to go have lunch? And we had a lot of time because freelancing in Hollywood, you have time where you're super busy and time when you're not. And it was wonderful. And then in 98, my sister had her second kid, and he realized I need to move back to Kentucky and be with my grandkids. And so he moved back here. But then just to round it out, we bought this house the end of 2008 to move back from California. Clay was a baby. My dad was here when we were scouting it, and he was sick. He had cancer at that point. And so he died when Clay was 5 months old. And so my first Father's Day as a dad was my first Father's Day without my dad.
Yeah.
Circles,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely circles. Yeah, definitely. And it sounds, Peter, you've got kind of the arts on your mother's side, and you've got on your dad's side the playwriting and the movie making. You're just
Yeah.
kind of carrying on the family business.
Well, here's the wild thing, man. When my grandmother had this box of 16 millimeter films in her basement, and I just thought they were home movies that my grandfather shot. So I had her ship them all out to California when I was in film school between my first and second year, and I
And it
was
was
watching.
early versions of Citizen Kane, was it?
Well, in a way, he, I didn't know this when I went to film school in California. He went out to California when he was in his 20s. He wanted to be in the film business.
Amazing.
He actually was working for this guy, William S. Hart, who was a very famous um, silent movie cowboy. And Cal Arts is right up the street from Hart High School. And so I was like living in a house right next to the high school named after the guy my grandfather worked for, you know, 60 years before that. So I really was continuing a family business that I didn't, it was an aspiration that I didn't even know about. It's very interesting. But my grandfather used to make 16 millimeter films of his hunting trips in the Rockies, and he would put title cards. So he had a title card stand. So he made these silent films with title cards.
Mm.
And then he did, just family movies, but he was shooting color 16 in the 30s. I've got color 16 millimeter film of my dad in 1940,
Mm.
1939. So
Amazing.
it really was. It
So,
was
so
like amateur, but aspirational.
So you've got this world that we talk about, where you're continuing the family business, where you're now
Yeah.
connecting sort of Kentucky and that rural upbringing with California, and you're a professor at the University of Arizona, and out of
Uh,
Arizona State. Uh,
yeah.
and so we've got Carbon Cowboys and Roots So Deep. How did you land on this particular narrative? Why was it? Because obviously this is all connecting up, but why did you land on adaptive multi-paddock grazing? Because there are lots of different approaches to farming that can deliver regenerative outcomes. What is it about AMP grazing in particular that made you want to hitch your wagon there?
Well, it started with one of the first people I interviewed in Carbon Nation, a guy named John Wick, who hadn't even started the Marin Carbon Project, which is a very well-known group in California at the time. He and his wife, Peggy Rathman, she's a very talented children's book author, like great books, like 10 Minutes to Bedtime, And oh gosh, I'm forgetting all the names, but Peggy Rathman, look her up. I buy her books for people all the time. She gave me a stack for Clay when he was born, and and they bought this ranch in Marin County, and John was a, you know, guy who thought he was an environmentalist and thought, well, someone's leasing the land to graze animals, I'll kick them off. So he kicked the guy off his land because that's what you do to be a good environmentalist, and his land died, just died. And that was his moment of what? And he then did the research, and so he brought animals in and started doing a form of rotational grazing and hired Wendy Silver out of UC Berkeley to do a whole bunch of research. So their sort of groundbreaking research is on what happens when you add compost to grazing land. And they've got, this is a 15-year study, continued study in two regions in California, sort of the mountains and then the Mediterranean coast and Marin, Mediterranean climate. So he's the guy who first got me thinking about cattle. And then I met a fellow named Peter Willis in South Africa who also was looking at this sort of thing. And this was when we were making Carbon Nation. So it was in there. And then the guy who narrated Carbon Nation was a guy named Bill Curtis, who's a famous newscaster and voice in Chicago. And he had a company called the Tall Grass Beef Company. And so I had this ideas of like, just what is the grazing thing? There's something there. He gave me a 2-hour conversation. He said, but you have to talk to Alan Williams. He's your guy. So that's how I met Alan, and my life just changed from that moment because Alan was the guy doing the grazing and learning about it and teaching it. And he's a key part of Roots So Deep. He's a key part of episode 4. He's a key part of the science team. And he's a good friend, and he's a key part of what we want to grow from here. And so that's why it happened. I was looking at soil because I knew if you treated soil well, you drew down carbon. If you treated soil poorly, you emitted carbon. But then I found out about the grazing, and the more I found out about it, the more it just made sense, but there was no science. So that's why we put together the science team.
Now, you say it makes sense. And, the way that you're talking about there, you've come in from this farm where there was an environmentalist who wanted to kick off the livestock and discovered that that was the wrong thing to do and brought them in. But that's an unusual experience. Still, certainly it would seem from a UK perspective, where there are so many environmentalists that still see cattle as the devil, something which is a real problem in climate change terms, rather than as part of the solution. So what was it that made you want to poke that bear? You're an environmentalist, clearly, from your
I thought the
background, the
same
way
thing.
that was it
Yeah.
that you wanted to was it that you wanted to poke environmentalists hard enough and robustly enough that they started to wake up to this solution, or was it something else?
No, I mean, when we made Carbonation, I thought the same thing. All my research was showing that cows were bad for the planet. We even made a cartoon called, I forget what it's called, Pain Forest. And it actually, we pulled it from the movie, but it's a really good cartoon. Um, and I was advised to not say "don't eat meat" in our "what you can do" section of the movie at the very end. So we said "meatless Mondays," right? And I was in Canada for the Canadian premiere of Carbonation, probably in 2011, and we were at this party for a film festival, and people were drinking quite a lot of beer. And this guy came up to me. He'd just seen my movie. He's like, my boys and I get together every Monday for a barbecue. He was really worried because we'd said meatless Mondays. I said, well, you could just not eat meat on Tuesday. He's like, I could do that. I'm like, yeah, you can do that. And he was so relieved and walked off very happy. Um, so that was where I was at. Even after meeting John Wick and going to the Rodale Institute, I was still there. It
But
was
Peter,
when,
lots of people are there. Lots of
no, no,
people are
but
there. And what
I'm
what
telling
made you change?
Yeah. Walking onto Alan Williams' farm, walking onto Neil Dennis's farm, and walking onto Gabe Brown's farm when I was shooting the footage that became Soil Carbon Cowboys. The land was so different than their neighbors. It smelled good. It sounded amazing. It was squishy. There was all these plants growing. The animals looked very healthy. I was new to it, but you could tell these are, you know? And then I learned all the signs as I made all the short films, because we made 10 short films on this type of grazing before we did Roots So Deep. And and you can watch all those 10 films on YouTube, Carbon Cowboys channel. All of them are there. And so it was that film that changed everything for me. And I was like, okay, this looks pretty amazing, but there's no science. So everyone who thinks cows are a problem, there's a lot of science showing they're a problem, and they are a problem. As a matter of fact, our science team wrote a paper in 2016 that shows that conventional grazing is actually worse than the most ardent anti-cow folks even know, because we counted not only all the carbon emissions from the growing of the grain and the cutting down of the forest and all that stuff, we counted the carbon that was in the soil that was eroded. And once you count that carbon, it's like it's huge, right? And so, but it was very different, very different, very different from what Gabe Brown and Alan Williams and Neil Dennis were doing, and then Will Harris, and then uh, uh, Emery Clark in that farm, and Birdwell Clark, I mean, is that farm in Texas. And then we're like, we got to do research. So we did a little bit of research in Canada in 2015. And we're like, oh wow, this is really showing something. And that's when we did the research in 2018. I didn't do this to poke at anybody. I did this because I'm looking for a freaking solution to climate change.
So tell
And
me a bit about Roots So Deep, because well, we're having this conversation about roots and everything else, and there's a degree to which I'm assuming that many people listening will already know about the movies, about the
I
documentaries.
hope,
Just take us through very quickly what the basic premise was and how
yeah,
you got there, because it was a massive project. I mean, it was before its time. It's probably the biggest, longest running science project into adaptive multi-paddock grazing and the positive impact of livestock on the planet. It's a 10-year, $10 million program. So just tell us a bit about it.
yeah. So when I made Soil Carbon Cowboys and started asking questions, there was no science other than a paper that Richard Teague had done, which was a good paper, but it was it. And so I met Richard Teague. And I met all these other scientists that year of 2013, and heard about this grant that was coupling human natural systems out of the National Science Foundation. And I emailed all these people I just spoke to for an hour. They didn't know me. I just had an hour-long chat. And every single one of them emailed me back within 2 hours, enthusiastically saying, yeah, I'm on board. And that's how the science team formed. And we first met in 2014 in January. And we realized we were a team. It was yes and yes and yes and, where a lot of these scientists have been pushed back and marginalized, beat up in their own research institutes. And so we formed this team in 2014, but we weren't out in the field doing science until 2018. And some of the science we didn't get funded until 2019, even though we started the work in 2018. The film was just part of this research project. I was primarily helping to run this science. So every decision I had to make that would be great for a movie had to be brought back to earth if it was going to affect the science in any way, because we couldn't get in the way of the farmers being happy we were there, right? And documentary filmmaking, sometimes you want to stir things up and get good TV, and just couldn't do it. And so the project was to compare adaptive multi-paddock grazing, which is emulating the way bison roamed across the Great Plains and other herding animals roamed across other grasslands around the planet, to conventional grazing, where instead of lots of small paddocks and the animals moving frequently, eating half the forage, leaving half to keep the ground covered, evenly spreading manure and urine and moving on. Conventional grazing was you just get a big field and they might move them every 3 months or every 3 weeks, but they overgraze. Their manure doesn't really get disintegrated because there's not a great thriving dung beetle population. And it's just a very different thing. And that's the norm. And so we wanted to compare 5 farm pairs in the Southeast US. And so that took years to find the
I was
farmers.
going to say, how did you do that? Because it's a really clear part of the narrative, isn't it? That you're not just comparing, two farms that are similar. They are literally side by side to each other,
Yeah,
which is brilliant in terms of the formatting. But how did you go about finding those?
that
Because
was the
I
design.
I, I can see why the regenerative, the adaptive multi-paddock farmer would be on board, but you
Yeah.
managed to persuade the conventional guys as well.
Yeah, because we went to them when we said, the conventional neighbors, we said, we're doing research across the fence. We think we've found a way to graze your animals that will save you money, save you time, and be more productive, but we can't do it without your help. Would you let us do this? Would you be a part of this? And one of the farmers, the conventional farmer says, well, what if the data shows we can be doing things better? Which I loved that question. I said, well, then we'll help if you want us to. And four out of the five chose to let us help after they saw the data, and which was remarkable. And
Why
so the
do you think the
point of
fifth didn't?
doing okay financially, didn't have the stresses, and just a little bit more in sort of set in his ways. Had a business that was actually about breeding bulls, so they actually sold bull semen as their main business. So things were okay there, but we know they've suffered from drought since then. We know. And we know that that farmer's really into grassland birds as well. So I haven't given up on that farmer at all. It just didn't happen in the cycle that I needed to finish the movie.
But even so, an
Um,
80% take-up rate is phenomenal.
it's massive. Like no one on the science team thought we'd get one. I hoped for one. And my hoping for one is not scientific, right? It's just me as a human being. And I'm not a scientist. And I know a lot of scientists who are human beings, but they put science above, right? Like I had to when I was making the movie. But I still was like, God, if any of these farmers can change, could you see the benefits? It's just we didn't know if it was a climate change solution as well, right? And that's been the longest data to get finished. We're supposed to get a very detailed report this summer that then can be turned into publications. And so the data we have in the movie is preliminary, but I asked that scientist to give me the conservative numbers, just like we did in carbonation. Just give me conservative numbers. Going up is easy. Going back is we'll do it. If the numbers through peer review become less, we'll either change the film or just make it very public that we need to change the data. We'll do whatever the data says. But the film's about, I thought the film was going to be about the scientists when I was thinking of the film. I thought the film was going to be just a module by module bunch of short films. It's going to be here's the bird people, here's the soil people, here's the microbe people, and the farmers will come and go. Filming with the farmers before the science team even showed up for that very first week in May of 2018, it just became perfectly clear this is a film about farmers, and the science team's going to be the supporting characters. And we just got so lucky that all of our farmers are compelling people and are interesting on camera and are
Really are.
funny.
Yeah.
We
And I
just
love, in the trailer, I love I love, my favorite bit of the trailer is when you kind of open up, you just go, I love farmers. And it's just, that sets the tone because it's about a love of farming. It's a love of livestock and everything else then just moves from there and slides into
But
place.
it didn't start that way for me. I was just looking for a solution to climate change. And then I found that grazing could be. So then I was like, well, let's get a science team together. And then I met all these farmers making the short films before Roots So Deep. And then Roots So Deep just brought me all the way through to I'm an advocate for farmers now. They're given the short end of the stick over and over and over in our society, yet we all eat. And so I'm now swinging for farmers, and as much as I am swinging for soils and swinging for climate change solutions.
So, going into the film, did you have a really clear sense of the science outcomes that you wanted to test, or did that kind of emerge? Because obviously, the Carbon Cowboy films were part of that journey that you were on, and Roots So
Right.
Deep is kind of, is the final outcome, if you like.
Yeah,
And
it's
so,
really in Carbon Cowboys, we were only on the adaptive side of the fence and we looked over the fence, but we never interviewed that farmer, right? And Roots So Deep, we got time with everyone, like all the time. And so it was a real education for me to find out that hey, those conventional farmers aren't judging their neighbors. They're curious, but they're just too polite to get in their business and ask. So I saw that as a huge opportunity. And the adaptive farmers, they don't want to tell people what to do. They're too polite to tell. And so by having the film there and meeting these folks and time, I just we just became friends. Again, that's not journalism, but I'm not a journalist. I'm a I'm a documentary filmmaker and I'm not afraid to make friends with people. You know, you know, there's all sorts of like theory about that. It just drives me crazy. Just do what you do and get what you get and be respectful and make sure everything you put in a film is what someone meant in the context of what they said. Just be very clear. We didn't know what the results from the science were going to be. We had the scientific game plan very well thought out. We were vetting our proposal more than most people vet peer-reviewed publications. We vetted that proposal for, gosh, 2 years because we were having a hard time raising the money, so we just kept vetting it at a very high level. And so we wanted to make sure that people from all sides of this debate who thought people should be vegan, who didn't think animals would be a solution, we still wanted those scientists to vet our research so that the methods, they would go, yeah, those are good methods. So then the data would speak for itself and they wouldn't lambast us for having bad methods.
Have people tried to? Because in the UK, just last week, we had one of the environmental populists, if you like,
Yeah.
columnists in a newspaper called The Guardian, who did a real, or tried to do a real hatchet job on FAI farms and some of their research into AMP grazing and then into the Sustainable Food Trust and a fantastic report that they'd done on livestock grazing. And most of what he said was patent nonsense. It was hugely selective. But of course, that narrative then goes out there. Did you have a sort of similar situation where you've got commentators and environmental NGOs kind of coming down on you because they just don't like cattle, they don't like farmers, they don't believe in the livestock as a solution? Or have you managed to get away from that because of doing the science over and over and getting it, in that really robust sort of state?
Yeah, but you were mentioning a journalist, but you didn't mention the journalist by name. Is that on purpose?
Well, I mean, it was George Monbiot who has a reputation for doing this kind of thing. He's an eco-modernist. He sees technology as the solution. He wants a farm-free future and food produced in laboratories. And actually, the last podcast that we put out was interviews with FAI and SFT pushing back
Yeah,
specifically against Monbiot. So no,
yeah.
it was just that I suppose that a US audience wouldn't necessarily know him so well.
Oh no, he's known. He's
Okay,
well known, certainly in this world. I've never met him. I find that I probably agree with more than not of his concerns about climate change and his concerns about conventional agriculture.
sure.
I would love to make a deal with him that if he takes 4 hours to watch Roots So Deep, he can just give me 4 hours of whatever he wants me to watch or read, and we'll just trade 4 hours of our time and then have a conversation. I would love that. I would love that. I've seen that he's supporting sort of like lab grown foods,
Yeah.
and that's concerning me because he writes a lot about big ag and big companies writ large, big industries. And who's going to afford to grow lab grown food but the big industries, right? So then you're going to put all of our food in a lab, and then a company or six companies are going to own that. So I'm concerned about that vision of the future that he has.
Not to mention
Um,
the energy that it would take. If we're
just the whole
talking,
system,
yeah,
the whole
yeah,
system. I mean, nature has so many answers to our problems. Um, and so really the time for me to have a conversation with them will be when this greenhouse gas report comes out and then we get those papers published. That's the
mm,
end of our research.
mm,
And so, yeah, I don't know if he even, I know he knows about our research because he's alluded to it. But I don't know, maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was alluding to FAI because we have funding for McDonald's. FAI had
yeah,
funding for McDonald's. So maybe he was alluding to that farm that I've visited a number of times and really like it.
mm,
But there's a perfect example of environmental groups kind of getting it wrong. I was on FAI farm, the first visit, I guess it was in 2019, and they said we used to have a lot of trees here, but Nature England had this program where they paid us to cut down these trees. Like right there, I'm worried. And the
In fact,
reason
in
they
fact, they insisted that the trees were cut down in order to get the rest of the higher level stewardship payment. Yeah,
right. And that was because there was a grassland bird that they wanted, and there was a predatory bird that lived in those trees. So if they remove the trees, the predatory bird won't be attacking the grassland bird.
exactly that. Yeah.
And that was just mind-blowingly crazy when I heard that. Um, Cutting down trees in this beautiful grazing pasture was the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. So, there's bad decisions everywhere, and you can look at my life and I could show you 12, 15, 30 bad decisions I've made in my life.
But they
But
probably have lower impacts than natural England's did.
probably, but they were based on fear. Like in my life, when I've made bad decisions, it's always based on fear. When I've been in the flow and really looking at life and really living in the moment, and I would say decisions made from love, then I've made good decisions. It's very simple for me. And I would call that decision to cut down those trees in that beautiful pasture based on fear, not based on data, not based on any kind of knowledge of a system. Oh my God, right? And so,
It certainly wasn't a system. It was a simple way of trying to address a single problem rather than looking at it in a holistic
right,
way and understanding
right.
the way that nature functions.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of visiting with James Rebanks, and the pushback he's gotten from nature loving groups has just been phenomenal. And what he does is he just uses his animals to solve the problem that they're trying to tell him to solve, and he does it better than they even imagined. So he has more wildlife, more diversity. And so he does this sort of FU jujitsu or whatever. I'm saying the word wrong, but yeah, I love what he's doing up there. But we haven't had too much pushback. We've been very, very, very clear about who our funders are. It's on our website. It's been there for years. Every dollar, we put it in the movie, so it's very clear in the movie where our money's coming from, or some of our money. And we we're up front. So I think our just sort of everything's up front helps us. And that was I wanted to do that. I didn't want to keep anything back. It just makes things worse anyway. It's bad business. Um, but just being up front with all that stuff. So we haven't had a ton of pushback, but I also don't think we're as big as we could get. And then I think there'll be more pushback. But I mean, our social media campaign is huge.
Indeed,
And
yeah. If you're not
and
going
you
to
look
get
at the
pushback,
comments, you look at the comments and the pushback is tiny.
yeah, yeah.
And
Look,
the common ground comments is massive.
we're coming towards the end of the time that we've got
Yeah.
together, and I really need to ask you about Donald Trump. And I
Do
wonder
you?
just, I think I do, particularly from a UK perspective, just how
Mhm.
polarized does it feel right now in the US? And what impact is that having on the climate and land resilience conversation?
I think that our country has always been less polarized than you'd think when you watch the political industrial complex channels. Especially when you talk about everything we've been talking about for this hour. When you talk about soil health, you find a lot of agreement, and we see that with our social media campaign. We've got 124 million views this week and lots of comments. And we get people saying, I think climate change is a hoax, but this is really great. I'm a vegan, but this is really great. I'm Native American, and this is really great. Now that I see people treating the land like we've always wished someone would treat the land, now they're the new Native Americans. I mean, we have these amazing comments coming in all the time. Farmers changing because they realize working with nature makes them happier and actually wealthier. Um, and so the polarization is, I think, more manufactured than not, but people are acting as if. So it kind of becomes real. I think Washington is very polarized. I think I think a lot of Donald Trump supporters just sort of don't believe him when he says some of the stuff he says, but I think we all should believe him when he says whatever he's saying. I think, that flood the zone was the game plan, flood the zone for this first approach. And there's a lot of I just don't like hypocrisy. I like a consistent viewpoint. Even if I disagree with it, at least it's consistent. Um, I think that with regards to soil health and natural food, there's there's a lot of strange bedfellows in this soup right now in the US. And I've seen that the whole time. It's like this country was built on divisiveness. This country was built on violence. This country was built on, look, the first English that came over here, England was too liberal in 16 whatever, right? The Pilgrims were more, they thought that the Church of England was too liberal. And they wanted to come here and create a religious state. And then other people came and like, no, we don't want that. We don't want a king. Um, am I worried about what's going on right now? I am very. I'm seeing a lot of really good people losing their jobs. I'm seeing that the American government is being, I don't know why. Why are all these really good people being fired? I mean, we need really good meteorologists. Why would you fire someone who's going to tell you where that hurricane's going to land within 10 minutes? What's the benefit? So I'm looking for like the reason. I'm looking for the benefit for all these actions that are happening right now, and I can't find them. I can't find the benefit. If it's small government, then I'm not seeing that because the costs of everything that's going on right now are higher than the salaries of the people that have been fired.
Peter,
And so,
we've got 2 minutes, and
yeah,
I think that I want to ask you to end on a hopeful note, because it
sure.
sounds from what you're saying that for you, the soil, the common ground that creates, the
Yep.
conversation about livestock, the fantastic Roots So Deep documentaries that you've made, which are available, that people can just go to your website, rootsodeep.org, and
Rootsodeep.org.
watch it. And it feels like that transcends the polarization and that
It
angst
does.
that you've been talking
It
about.
does. I've been in this particular space since '07. It absolutely transcends the polarization. I have had so many conversations with people who we should be disagreeing, and we're finding enough agreement. Listen, I'm sure it's the same in the UK. If you win an election by 60% in the UK, certainly in the US, it's a landslide. So that means if you agree on 6 out of 10 things in the United States with somebody, that's like a landslide. Yet we're supposed to agree on 10 out of 10. It's an artificial mechanism to make people be afraid so they act in ways that only benefit a few. And nature's going to win. Whether we work with nature or not, nature's going to win. Nature bats 1,000. That's a baseball term. And that means you've hit every single pitch. Nobody bats 1,000. In baseball, if you hit 3 out of 10, you're doing great. Nature bats 1,000. Nature bats 10 out of 10 every time. And so I'm just aligning with nature. And the farmers I know that are aligning with nature are smart and successful. And so now and we could talk about this in another interview, we're building a project to get to as many farmers as possible to make it easy for them to learn about soil health and make it easy for them to change.
Peter,
That's
let's
the goal.
come back and have that conversation, because it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. But, we're slightly over time, and I know that you
Yep.
have to go because you've got meetings, and that's all we've got
Yeah.
time for. So thank you so much. I'd like to thank my guest, Peter Byck, the director and producer of Roots So Deep. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. And please do flip back through your podcast feed for more Farmgate leaders interviews, for our topical news magazine, Wheat from the Chaff, and for our Filling the Funding Gap series, which aims to help farmers and other landowners to unlock natural capital market opportunities. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.